What I would like to speak to you today on this is essentially the relationship between evidence and decision making. We focus a lot on how we can collect data, how we can create a shared situation awareness, how we can develop more and more sophisticated tool for getting that overview that often we desperately lack. And instead of presenting you some of the concrete tools that we work on in ACAPS with respect to that, we do a number of different analysis products, and by all means, you should check that out on our website. Instead of doing that, I would like to try to stretch a few mindset with respect to what's actually the impact of all this data we collect. What is the relationship between data, information, analysis, and then decision making? How does that chain function? And what are some of the common mistakes we make in ensuring that we have good evidence-based decision making? And what are some of the good rules of thumb that we have to avoid making those mistakes? Maybe two words about ACAPS. First, to sort of position us in the humanitarian landscape. We are a humanitarian service provider. We see ourselves as a public good in the humanitarian sector. We are a team of around 65 staff across the world. And we do one thing only. We produce analysis of crisis to help decision makers who are involved in humanitarian action make better decisions. We do that in a number of different ways, through a global severity crisis index that every month gives you a number on how severe the crises are across the world. We do that by providing deep dives into anything from the monsoon in Cox's Bazar to how Venezuelan caminantes move across the Latin American continent. And we do that by looking forward and trying to, through scenarios and risk identification, see what's on the other side of the horizon, what's coming our way the next 6 or 9 months. We are somewhere in between the we sometimes call ourselves the lonely planet for humanitarians, or the business intelligence unit for humanitarians. So that's just to give you an idea about what we do. When I chose to not do a presentation today, but to speak to you like this, it's because it's a pretty simple message I have for you. And I don't want that to get lost in a lot of colorful maps or overviews of products or discussions about methodological details. I'd like to really try to dig deep in terms of how do we actually make sense out of crisis? How do we shape the humanitarian narrative, if you want? How do we tell that story? How do we construct the problem that we as decision makers are trying to solve? And that's why I chose the first part of the title, Black Swan, because what we deal with is often the unexpected. We are living through the pandemic right now, and if I ever saw a black swan, that was it. I think the secondary effects of the COVID pandemic has reshaped humanitarian outcomes across the world in ways we didn't expect. I think we had a fairly good understanding of the primary effects of how a pandemic unfolds, how people are infected, what we can do to prevent that. Even that pushed us to the limit. But when it came to then understand the cascading effects of this massive change in social behavior that we've seen over the past couple of years, we were pretty much lost, would be my argument. And so the black swan for me is very present in our work today. And we have to ask ourselves whenever we engage with a crisis, whether we truly have understood the nature of that problem. So that's the first part, the black swan. The second part is the black box. That's about decision making. And that's something that I find humanitarians sometimes are slightly uncomfortable talking about. I once spoke to a researcher who came back from Ebola in West Africa after having looked at the humanitarian response there. And he said to me, you know, the hardest thing in the world is to get to a humanitarian to admit that he or she makes a decision. We like to hide behind the data. We like to either actually hide behind our data or our experience, rather than saying, there are a number of options here and I choose to go left instead of right. And so the second part is the black box. How do we actually make decisions? How are those reports that we formulate? How is that information we process? How is that transformed into a number of response options? And I think if we have a few studies of that, but essentially those studies tell us two things. One, we pretty much do what we did last time. So there's a high level of path dependency in our decision-making. Most of the crises we deal with are recurring. We've seen them before in this area, flooding, the Capri Strip in Namibia, whatever. And then we know what it went last time. Let's do 10% more or less. That's one thing that the research shows us. And the other one is that the strongest voice tend to dominate. So whoever is around the table when decisions are made, the strongest voice tends to get to shape what the problem is. So in other words, to a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. I'm sure you're familiar with that saying, right? So that's the black box. The question now is what happens when you take a black swan and put it into a black box? It gets pretty murky. And what I will try to then give you is just that overview of how we in ACAPS over the past 10 years have tried to come to terms with that. How do we know that when we write a report in Geneva, that actually makes a difference in the field? How can we see that? How should we think about that chain reaction that happens? Our success lies in the agency of others, if you want. And so how do we think about that? That's what I would like to share with you. And I'd like to begin with our slogan, with our call to action, if you want. It is see the crisis, change the outcome. Two things: see the crisis, provide the most accurate description of the situation we deal with, but then also change the outcome. Think about your decision maker, think about the situation they're in. How do you do the best possible decision-making support? And those two things go hand in hand. And I'm sure you can see by now why I called the presentation what I did. It's describe the black swan as well as you can. And then make sure that your input into the black box gives you the right output. To make it a bit more concrete, I was in Pakistan in 2010 during the floods. I was the UNTAC team leader in that operation. And it was a massive crisis. After 3 weeks, we had more than 20 million people affected by flooding. It was unprecedented in Pakistan, and it was really difficult to understand what was going on and where to focus. And so, as the UNTAC team leader, of course, assessment was one of my priorities. And what we did was we put together a big multi-sector needs assessment under the intercluster coordination mechanism. And we did a big data collection tool that took about 45 minutes to distribute. We then went out to this huge area that was flooded and collected more than 2,400 household interviews. We did 400 focus group discussions. And then we came back to Islamabad with this massive cube of data. And then we sat down to analyze it. And I'll tell you the punchline first. When we published the report after a month, one, most of the decisions in that operation that really mattered had already been made. And two, somebody came up to me and said, you put us through all of this and you give us a report that tells us that water is wet. Right? So basically, we had spent weeks of very hard work, very difficult work, producing a report on a massive data source that didn't really help anybody do a better job. There was a very troubling, not to say humiliating, professional experience for me and for everybody involved in that exercise. And so what did we do wrong? Well, I think firstly, we focused on one thing and one thing only, and that was to collect data. 90% of our time was spent in the field with a clipboard, talking to people. And we had that massive amount of data, and that looked great. But actually, when you think about it, we used maybe we used 20% of that data. Probably 80% of the questions or the data we collected never entered into any report, was never used. It simply wasn't a good question we asked. It didn't tell us anything. So that was a massive waste of time. Secondly, it takes you so long to collect this data that by the time you get back and get it analyzed, things have moved on. And you know as well as me that in a sudden onset, the decision makers, you know, they don't sit and wait for you to be done with your report. They make the decision when the cameras are on, when the attention is there. That's when the big lines in the operation is shaped. So we were way too late. And thirdly, I don't think we were clear on what we actually needed to know. I think we focused on what we needed to ask people, and that's different. We needed to think through the analytical framework underpinning that crisis, and instead we were discussing how to ask the most precise question about which latrine do you use in this village. So as I said, that was quite a troubling exercise, and I actually don't enjoy that much talking about it. Even less so because half a year earlier, we had done exactly the same during the Haiti earthquake in 2010, right? And so the lesson for us, and when I say us, it's not ACAPS, it was the humanitarian community collectively that failed in this way. I think the lesson was that this is a systemic problem, that we simply don't have the right approach to making sense out of crisis. And that's when we in ACAPS stopped talking about data collection forms and confidence intervals and started talking about constructing the humanitarian narrative, telling a story, storytelling. How do you do that? Simply revisiting the whole idea around what does it actually mean to provide an assessment. It may sound a bit spaced out to you to talk about storytelling when you have something like a crisis on the table, but I think it's incredibly important that we recognize that and we start from that perspective that no matter what, a crisis is something we put together. There are certain things we choose to focus on, and there are certain things we leave out of the story. And revisiting that and ensuring that we have a very deliberate and clear way of thinking about the way this particular narrative has been put together is incredibly important. You can go back to Ebola in West Africa and you can ask yourself, what kind of a crisis was that? It was a public health crisis, clearly. Was it a cultural crisis because of burial practices? Yeah, probably. Was it a security crisis? Well, at least some actors started looking at it like that when people traveled out of the region and infected other people across the globe. Where do you put the emphasis? How do you construct this crisis? That will also tell you this, that will give you the solutions you seek to it. So it's incredibly important to go back to the way it's constructed. To boil that down, to make that manageable, what we came up with was 3 basic rules that we try to follow when we do analysis of crisis. Rule number 1 is so simple that it almost sounds nonsensical. It is know what you need to know. Know what you need to know. And it sounds obvious, but if you think about it, how clear are you actually, if you are involved in information management, how clear are you actually on what your information requirements are? How deliberate are you about that? How well do you empathize with your decision maker? Do you have eyes on your decision maker? Do you know what they need to know? Do you know what the decision they want to make is and how you inform that in the most timely, cost-effective way? So that's rule number 1, know what you need to know. Rule number 2, and this is in some ways the hardest one to overcome, make sense, not data. If you talk about analysis, if you talk about decision-making support, it is a sense-making process, not a data collection process. And I just can't say that enough times. I see again and again in international responses, people driving out in their Land Cruisers to the nearest affected village with a clipboard in their hand, asking questions together with a whole bunch of their other colleagues, coming back to headquarters. And those data collection forms are never filled into any computer, they're never analyzed in any practical way. It is a waste of time. People are collecting data, they're not making sense. Flip that around. Make sense, not data. Analysis is the centerpiece that we are talking about here, especially when you are in rapidly unfolding crisis. If you don't do it like that, you won't get it right. So analysis, I can't say it enough. And we recently had a cyclone in the Philippines, Cyclone Rai, and when I looked at the way that was assessed, it was a total rerun of what we did during Cyclone Haiyan 5-6 years ago. And that wasn't good. That was exactly that. We ran around trying to collect bits and bobs of data without being able to make sense out of it. So I hope this speaks to you, and I hope this resonates with your experience. And again, the plea is, make sense, not data. The third point is then a call for a good enough approach. And that's also really difficult to do, but the rule is, don't be precisely wrong, be approximately right. And if you go back to the story I told you about Pakistan, that was one of the problems there. We were precisely wrong. We had a very granular picture with 2,400 data points from across the country. And yeah, it told us what things were like a couple of weeks ago. It just wasn't what we needed to know. We needed to know the fundamental differences between the three main provinces of it. Right? So we were nerding around describing the individual trees, and we needed to see the forest, and we didn't. So don't be precisely wrong, be approximately right. In order to do that, you need to use what we would call a good enough approach, where basically you are able to deliver in a timely manner a product that provides a holistic analysis of a crisis. And I can tell you that if you're dealing with a room of UN agencies and NGOs who are in the midst of a very high-profile crisis where they know there's a lot of funding in the air, and they know that the way the assessment is going to be conducted and the findings of the assessment is going to inform what the donors will fund, it is very, very, very difficult to get them to work with a good enough approach. It's very difficult to get them out of their specific corners, insisting on a very precise, very elaborate methodology that gives them exactly the information they need within food security, within health, within child protection, within whatever they might be working with. It's borderline impossible. And so the third point really speaks to the fact that our institutional self-interest pollutes the sense-making process. So that if you have a room full of people who are going to do something about a crisis and are going to somehow get their budgets from whatever the assessment tells them, then they bring that into the room. And that shapes the way they think about a crisis to a hammer. Every problem looks like a nail is basically what I'm saying. And it's a very deep-rooted problem in the humanitarian sector because of our sectoral coordination mechanism, and it's incredibly difficult to overcome. So those three rules: know what you need to know, make sense, not data, don't be precisely wrong, be approximately right. That's basically, as far as it goes, ACAPS's approach to analysis. The rest we make up on the spot. Those three rules, we don't break. That's what we think about. And then we adapt our methodology to the specific settings. What are those settings then? For us, it boils down to 4 parameters that vary and that determine the type of methodology we use. Firstly, it's the level of uncertainty. So what is our level of information? How much do we know about the crisis? Is it a well-lit territory, or is it very often sketchy and unevenly lit? So level of uncertainty, a high level of uncertainty, speaks to more robust, simple tools that we can quickly employ. And if we have less uncertainty, we can maybe do something slightly more sophisticated. But the amount of data is not the only parameter. Actually, uncertainty cannot be understood without also thinking around ambiguity. If you think about COVID again, we had tremendous amounts of data from across the world in terms of how things were moving. But those data streams meant something different before and after the pandemic. So the pandemic changed the analytical framework that we had to use to understand the world. We have so many examples of how unintended effects occurred, and how data that used to give us a clear picture about what was going on certainly was not very useful, because the assumptions underpinning that data changed. a small fun example is the way lipstick and eye makeup sales evolved. Now I think this is a predominantly male territory, so maybe that's not of your own experience, but lipstick plummeted. Nobody bought lipstick. Eye makeup skyrocketed because you saw that on camera, and how you made yourself up really influenced the way people would perceive you. Now that's one small example of how our behavior changed during COVID. If you take 50 of those examples, and they're not about how we put on makeup, but they are about people's consumption of food, education, cell phones, whatever. And you then imagine how the effects cascade among these different variables. That gives you an idea of just how complex it is to actually understand what the heck is going on with COVID and how that has impacted the world. So that's ambiguity. Are we really sure that we understand? Can we trust the lens that we look at the world through? Can we trust that lens, or has it shifted? That's where the black swan comes in. Is this event what we expect it to be, or is it something different? So we look at, when we shape our methodology, we look at uncertainty. How much do we know? How much data do we have? Ambiguity. Do we have a robust analytical framework to actually interpret and understand this data? The third point then is time pressure. There's a massive difference between having to deliver an analysis in 48 hours and in 2 weeks. So if you have 2 weeks, you can do something far more sophisticated. If you have 48 hours, you can do much less. That's obvious. So uncertainty, ambiguity, time pressure. And the last one is the nature of the decision maker you're trying to inform. Are you speaking into a national disaster management authority, which is well structured, where there's a uniform culture, where you basically know each other's first names, and it's easy when you say something, it's clearly understood. If you have that sort of very, very well-structured decision-making audience, you can do something fairly sophisticated. If you're trying to create a shared situation awareness among 400 NGOs flocking into Haiti after the earthquake, you have to have a far more basic palette. You have to tell a far more basic story. And the attempt there is not to get people to do the right thing in a sense, but to synchronize mindsets across a large number of actors to ensure a shared situation awareness, and that you can somehow speak to each other. Right? So for us, the key to really having a good assessment is the 3 rules. Know what you need to know, makes sense, not data. Don't be precisely wrong, be approximately right. And then pick your specific methodology according to uncertainty, how much data is available, ambiguity, whether you have a solid analytical framework or not. Thirdly, the time pressure you're under to ensure that you have it on the table when the decision is made. And fourthly, whether you're dealing with a very well-structured audience for decision-making and a very sort of punctual decision, or it's much more around this broad storytelling, synchronizing mindsets across many different actors. That's our approach. And then the specific exercise we put together depends on the context and those rules. I have almost used my time. I'd like to just spend 2 minutes on speaking to the relationship between analysis or decision-making support and decisions on the other side. The first thing is decisions are inherently political in nature. And that sometimes for technical people is quite uncomfortable, but it doesn't make sense to say that a decision is not political. It is a choice between different options, and that's more or less the definition of politics. So we shouldn't cry about politics getting involved and people not doing what's in the assessment report. That simply is the name of the game. That into the black box comes our experience, our interest, politics, and some evidence through the assessment or through the narrative we have shaped for this crisis, and out comes a decision. Now, the interesting thing is then to look at the relationship between the evidence base that informed the decision and the decision. Essentially, you can get it right with the worst or no assessment in the world. You can get lucky, or maybe you have enough experience to actually make the right decision without having very good evidence. And the opposite is true as well. You can make the wrong decision, even with the most comprehensive convincing evidence base on the table, a group of decision makers can still make the wrong decision. So what is actually the ambition of doing decision-making support? What is that action? For me, it is accountability and learning. Because no matter whether you make the right or the wrong decision, you cannot learn unless it's clear for you what was the evidence that went in and what were the options we considered, and then what was the choice we made. If you don't have that evidence on the table, it's not possible for you to have institutional learning. It's not possible to be accountable and go back and say, you know what, our response was based on the assumption that it wouldn't rain after the middle of August. That was a wrong assumption. We can see that now, and it led to an increased caseload of displaced persons. We were not prepared. That was a mistake. Let's learn from that. But very often, my experience is that we hide away how the decision was made because we are uncomfortable with the disconnect between the evidence base that was on the table when the decision was made and what came out of the black box. We don't like that. So we don't go through that middle step of actually documenting how the heck did we reach this result. And if we don't do that, we cannot be accountable. We cannot learn. Those are the words I have for you today. So the 3 rules, the 4 dimensions of the information space you have to think about when you pick your methodology, and then finally this bit about the relationship between the evidence and the decision we make. How do we get that right? How do we make ourselves accountable? How do we learn and progress? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nissen, for this nice presentation. There are a question in chat. Emergency this to ask. Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Nissen. I would like to learn your opinion about the role and importance of language in data sharing, and what do you think about its impact on sense making?
Yeah, I think that there's a tremendous power in languages, and that is actually one of the major problems we face, that we don't manage to capture a diversity of a wide range of perspectives from, if you go to Congo, from, I don't know how many languages there are in Congo, but there's more than 100, would be my guess. If you're dealing with 4 or 5 different languages and you barely operate in French, which is the colonial language, how are you going to know what people actually think? And if you don't know that, then the story you construct, the narrative you construct, the story you tell, will exclude those perspectives. And if we talk about being needs-based, or who defines what needs are? Who defines who is the beneficiary? Who defines that they actually benefit, right? If we monopolize that and only do that in our own languages, then we will get it wrong, or at least we will not, as it goes, will not enhance the agency of crisis-affected populations. A big part of that is the right to also have your story heard and be included in the story we tell. And very often I find that story is limited by our language, as you say, and then it's really shaped by our needs for fundraising.
May I have a question, please?
Of course, please.
Thank you for the presentation. May it be meaningful to train the local communities with data literacy as a part of disaster preparedness, or this idea is too utopian? As a person from another place and culture, are we gathering the data from just our perspective? Would it help with sense making?
I think it absolutely would. And I think we talk a lot about localization. Sometimes we frame it as decolonization, the discussions we have in the humanitarian sector these days. And yes, I think that is key. The question though is, how do you do that? Do you do that by sitting wherever you sit and then program an app, and then you go to the field and say, hey, here's an app. Why don't you put your data in here? Or do you go out and listen? Right? What we have today is a tremendous opportunity, because smartphones are penetrating literally the whole world. And people are on social media and are using these clever devices to communicate and to tell their stories. My question, we have to ask ourselves two questions. Do they have what they need to give us the data, and do we have the ears to actually hear what they're saying? And if I know us right, we are more comfortable with the first question and not so much with our own ears. So what is our own ability to actually ingest data that is coming from the communities? You spoke about social media before with Thomas, and I think that's an obvious example of how information travels in the local communities. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Mr. Nissen. Are there any other question or contribution?
Actually, I have a very quick question. You have been on the field for a very long time, right? And you work with human face to face. On the other hand, I'm a tech guy. I do use computers in my office most of the time. I was wondering the use of computers for big data handling, or the topic of, say, artificial intelligence, deep learning. I really wonder, can they be a big hand in the humanitarian sector, or they are just, you know, the hot topics in the tech sector, technical sector? What do you think?
I think we need to explore that, and I think there is space for that. But I think the fundamental problem we face, and I'm probably going to get this the wrong way around, is I think if I say small n, big P, does that make sense? Maybe. So if you have an Excel sheet, if I understand machine learning correctly, it works best when you have 5 columns and then 10,000 lines, because then you have enough observations to actually begin to train the AI and see some patterns and so on and so forth. I would argue that what we have in the humanitarian sector often is 20 lines and then 200 variables. And what determines the outcome in the specific context is the linkages between those 200. And it is very, very difficult to actually detect, as far as I can see, with current machine learning, what the patterns are. There was once a discussion with, I can't remember whether it was MIT or there was somebody from the States who was working with, I think WFP on learning how to predict food insecurity in East Africa, for example. Right? And they came and they said, well, you know, fantastic, we now have it up to 85% or something like that. And one of the researchers said, yeah, that's good. But the two you miss are the two you can absolutely not miss. That's where people die. And that's a bit the problem we have, right? That context is king when it comes to disasters because we're dealing with black swans. And what makes me nervous about machine learning is that it potentially can put us on autopilot and make us overlook the real critical issues. Having said that, I'm not a Luddite. I really believe that we need to explore this and that there are things that can be done. There's a very nice community called Humanitarian AI Today. They have a podcast where they do explore some of these things. There's a colleague called Sarah Spencer who has written a report about AI and the humanitarian sector published by ODI, HBN. If you're not familiar with that, I can recommend that as a good read. So I think we absolutely, we can't afford not to think about it. We absolutely have to think about it, but we just have to be careful that it is really driven by the context and the humanitarian outcomes and not by a very clever tech agenda.